In World War II London, most people came together to fight for victory, whether on the front lines, in factories or on farms. But there were some who took advantage of the chaos of war to indulge in their own depraved desires, hoping they would get away with their crimes by slipping away into the blackout, with fewer police on the streets to catch them. Most people wearing a military uniform automatically inspired trust and respect for the sacrifice they were making for their country. But as 21-year-old Iris Deeley tragically found out on Valentine's Day 1944, not everyone wearing medals could be trusted. When global conflict broke out in September 1939, Iris Miriam Deeley couldn't wait to do her bit for the war effort. She lived in Wanstead, East London, with her father Donald and mother Miriam, and after leaving school, she secured a job as a clerk for the National Bank of India in Bishopsgate, where her father worked. She left to join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, in 1942 as soon as she was old enough, and was stationed at the RAF Kidbrooke Balloon Centre in southeast London. She learned to repair and maintain aircraft there, and her keen eye and strong work ethic saw her promoted to leading aircraft woman. She was attractive, friendly and intelligent, and was described as one of the sweetest and prettiest girls one could wish to meet. In February 1944, 21-year-old Iris had been granted a weekend's leave, which she spent with Bill Quill, a young radar operator to whom she had become engaged just a week before. Bill had dropped her off at Charing Cross Station at around 10 p.m. on the evening of Sunday 13th of February, but she missed the last train back to her base by moments. She found a public telephone and called her unit to let them know she would be late, and a commanding officer suggested she get a train to Lewisham instead, and either take a taxi from there or walk the last couple of miles. The next train to Lewisham wouldn't arrive for several hours, but Iris had grown used to the unpredictability of public transport during wartime and settled down at the station to wait. She finally boarded the train and disembarked at Lewisham Station in the early hours of the morning, then continued her journey towards Kidbrooke on foot. Iris was not the only person walking the dark streets at this unsociable hour. A 20-year-old Royal Artillery gunner named Ernest James Harmon Kemp was also wandering the unlit lonely roads. Ernest had grown up in Deptford with his mother Alice, who had lost her first husband in World War I and then had a short-lived relationship which resulted in Ernest's birth, after which his father had little or no involvement in their lives. After leaving school, the young man worked as a paperboy for stationers W.H. Smith, a railway station porter, and a driver's assistant for Whitbread's brewery. His mother was in ill health, and he spent most of his spare time looking after her until he was called up for military service at 18. Ernest had a reputation for recounting improbable stories that gave an overinflated impression of himself, and he wore an array of medals and ribbons on his uniform from campaigns that had taken place before he was born, including World War I Sergeant's Stripes, Glider Pilot's Wings, and the Palestine Medal. He was known in his unit for investing more time and energy into womanizing than soldiering, and he had been fined £5 in 1943 for sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. Ernest's mother died in the same year, which came as a cathartic ending after 9 years of caring for her. Ernest went AWOL from his Royal Artillery duties on 24 occasions, and his most recent unauthorised journey over the hill had ended with a spell in a military prison. Kemp was an impulsive young man who rarely thought before acting, and during a trip to the dentist under military escort, he faked a desperate need to use the bathroom, climbed out of the window and absconded. In the early morning hours of Monday, 14th of February, Kemp was idly loitering around the southeast London streets. He may not have been actively looking for trouble, but when opportunities presented themselves, he rarely bothered to exercise restraint. When Iris Deeley crossed his path, dressed smartly in her service uniform and cap, with a smile brightening her face despite the fatigue from her long journey, Kemp felt a rising urge that he was unable or unwilling to control. The 20-year-old fugitive soldier approached a young WAAF officer, startling her as he emerged from a gloomy alleyway near Eltham Wellhall railway station. She jumped back in surprise, and he engaged her in an ostensibly friendly conversation for a few minutes. He reached out a hand towards her, and she knocked it away, irritated by the man's presumption. Iris was frightened by Kemp's staring eyes and erratic behaviour, but before she had time to consider running, he put his hand over her mouth and pulled her towards the nearby allotments, which were empty and abandoned at night time. She tried to struggle, but Kemp twisted her scarf around her neck and dragged her to the ground, witnessed by no one except the silent rows of vegetables, cabbages, potatoes and carrots planted by everyday citizens whom the government had exhorted to dig for victory, all of whom were doing more to help win the war while keeping the British public fed than Kemp had done in his short tenure in the army. Iris fell silent, and Kemp finally eased his grip on her scarf and checked her pulse. She was dead. He had intended to rape her, not to kill her, but he was determined to go through with his plan. He dragged her further into the allotment out of sight, removed her clothes and sexually assaulted her. Before running off into the night, he took her silver cigarette case, a purse containing £14, a fountain pen, a Ronson lighter, and a book of clothing ration coupons in the name of her fiancé, Bill Quill. Just after 8:30 a.m, Southern Railway policeman Arthur Belcher discovered the body on his way to work. Shaking with horror, he phoned the police, and Superintendent Rawlings, Divisional Detective Inspector Green, and Detective Inspector Leeming of the Eltham Criminal Investigation Department arrived at the scene. The young woman was lying face down, her left cheek partially buried in the soil. Marks around her neck suggested strangulation, and she was naked but for her stockings and gloves. Her torn and ripped clothing, including the scarf used to strangle her, were piled clumsily on top of her body. About 30 yards away, her service cap lay on the damp earth alongside a copy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, which she'd been carrying when she was attacked. She was identified as leading aircraft woman Iris Deeley, service number 2130707. Police broke the news to her distraught parents and fiancé Bill, who was granted 48 hours compassionate leave to come to terms with his sudden and devastating loss. The engagement ring he had given her just 7 days before was the only item of value left on her body, which had escaped the same fate as her money and other valuables, as it was hidden under her glove. The police surgeon estimated that Iris had been dead for at least 6 hours, which was corroborated by witness statements from people living in the row of houses which backed onto the allotments. Council employee Alfred Hayes reported that he heard a female voice crying out at about 2 a.m, but had thought no more of it until he heard the dreadful news in the morning. A search along the railway embankment turned up a soldier's khaki woolen glove, and footprints in the mud suggested that the attacker had worn heavy army-issue boots. Combined with statements from witnesses who saw Iris with a talkative soldier wearing an extraordinary number of medals pinned to his tunic, it was evident that detectives were searching for a serviceman. Iris Deeley was buried with full military honours at the City of London cemetery, while police scrutinised the young woman's diary for clues and toured local jewellers and pawnbrokers to try and trace the stolen cigarette case. About a week later, Police Constable Charles Memory was on patrol when he spotted a soldier whose uniform was festooned with medals. The man looked suspiciously young to be so well decorated, and PC Memory walked towards him for a closer inspection. He was right. Some of the medals on his uniform were from World War I, when the youth couldn't possibly have been born, let alone old enough to serve. Although stolen valour wasn't a concept in common parlance at the time, the police officer's hackles rose, particularly in view of the witness statement about the soldier seen talking to the murder victim, so he took the man in for questioning. At the police station, officers learned that his name was Ernest James Carman Kemp. Inside Kemp's rucksack, they found a cigarette case, wallet and fountain pen belonging to Iris Deeley. The stolen clothing coupons were missing, and police established that Kemp had already used them to purchase clothes for himself. If this wasn't enough, his boot print matched the size and pattern of a plaster cast taken of a muddy print at the crime scene. He was evasive during questioning, but the evidence spoke for itself, and they had little need of a confession. On 23rd of February 1944, Gunner Kemp was charged with the murder of Iris Deeley. He pleaded not guilty, but admitted in court that he had intended to rape the 21-year-old, but claimed that the murder was an accident, and although he had removed her clothes, he had not interfered with her. When describing how he had pulled the scarf tight around her neck, his tone was distant and detached as he explained, "She went out and I felt her heart and found she was gone." He offered no defence for his actions and told the judge and jury that on discovering he had killed her, his reaction was simply that there was no use crying over spilt milk. The jury found his lack of contrition and repentance abhorrent, and they found him guilty at the Old Bailey after just 16 minutes of deliberation. Reported crime had gone up by 57% during the war years in England and Wales for a variety of reasons, which included the ease of criminals roaming unseen during blackouts, the chaos and destruction of bombing raids across the country, and a severely reduced police force which had lost many men to the front lines. Even so, most crimes were acquisitive in nature, and violent assaults and murders were just as shocking as they had always been, if not more so, at a time when citizens were coming together with pride and unity to help keep the country running. Ernest Kemp was sentenced to death, but with a recommendation to mercy due to his age. Kemp's aunt and uncle, his only surviving relatives, were ignorant of their nephew's arrest until a neighbour read about it in the newspaper and knocked on their door to tell them. Kemp made an unsuccessful appeal, and his execution date was set for 8 a.m. on Tuesday 6th of June 1944. The day before he would be expunged from the earth for good, prolific hangman Albert Pierrepoint and his assistant visited Wandsworth Prison and discreetly viewed the condemned man through the Judas hole in the cell door, as was the custom, to assess his physical features so they could plan the perfect hanging. Combined with the details of Kemp's height and weight obtained from the prison records, Pierrepoint prepared the appropriate length of rope using the approved Home Office table of drops and tested it using a sack that weighed about the same as the prisoner. On Kemp's final morning, just hours after British, American and Canadian forces successfully landed on the Normandy beaches, he dressed in his service uniform and waited. When his cell door opened at exactly 8 a.m, he knew that his remaining time would be counted in seconds rather than minutes. His arms were secured behind his back with a leather strap, and he was escorted to the execution chamber, where he was positioned on a marked spot on the trapdoor. Pierrepoint rapidly placed a white hood over his head and a noose around his neck, while his assistant fastened his legs together with a leather strap. The metal eye, through which the rope was looped, was positioned under Kemp's left jawbone. The hangman stepped back behind a painted white line, and less than 1 minute after the prisoner had been collected from his cell, the lever was pulled to release the trapdoor. The velocity of the drop and the position of the metal eye forced Kemp's head back, breaking his spine. The neck was broken in the same position in every execution, becoming known as the hangman's fracture. As per Home Office regulations, the body was left to hang for 1 hour before the rope was pulled back up through the trapdoor, and 20-year-old Kemp was released from the noose and prepared for burial in the prison grounds. In a perverse twist of fate, the army had failed to discharge Kemp before his execution, and as a result, he remained on the list of war dead who would later be celebrated on the Brookwood Memorial in the Surrey countryside, his name etched alongside those who courageously gave their lives for their country. Kemp, at least, has a known burial site, an honour which thousands of servicemen and women would never receive, including those who died in the sea, air, or as prisoners of war on foreign soil from whence their bodies could not be recovered. Those who visit the Brookwood Memorial to pay their respects would no doubt consider it a hurtful debasement to know that the name of a killer is forever engraved next to those of their fallen ancestors and countrymen. Thank you for listening to Prasha's Murder Map. If you're interested in vintage crimes, you might enjoy some of my other episodes, particularly my Penny Dreadfuls collections from the Victorian era. There are currently 3 for you to check out, as well as episodes on Jack the Ripper, the Brides in the Bath murders, serial killer Paula Gortsov who operated in Nazi Germany, Christiana Edmonds, the chocolate cream killer, and many more, plus cases from more modern times. You can find all the links in the description below. This show is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so your support is really appreciated. Please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, or leave me a comment or review. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashgandran.com. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you again soon.